Hello, everyone, and welcome to our joint webinar today. I'm Jonathan Malone-McGrew with Solimar Systems, and I am really excited today to have CommonLook on with us, our accessibility partner. They are part of a much larger accessibility offering that we will hear a little bit about here in the intro. But let me introduce my co-presenter, David Herr. And Dave, jump in here and tell our nice audience here what you do for CommonLook, what CommonLook does, and how you offer solutions to the market.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jonathan, and we're happy to be able to present today. David Herr, I'm the Vice President of Enterprise Solutions here at CommonLook, which is now part of T-Base, which is also aligned with Accessible 360. So our new company is a full-service accessibility offering organization that can do alternative formats like large print and Braille. CommonLook specialty has always been around accessible PDF, and we can do accessibility audits through our Accessible 360 partnership. So, all three of our companies have come together as one, and we're pretty excited. We're going to be announcing a new company name in the next couple of weeks here. So we'll be announcing all of that. But for now, think of me as CommonLook.
And I love that. It's neat to see technologies come together, as a software company as well at Solimar doing workflow. We like to think of ourselves as glue that brings things together in the greater workflow. And actually, that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about why accessibility needs to be a part of your print and digital strategy. It needs to be about what you're thinking about, how you're growing it, and we're going to tell you why it's important, right, Dave? We're going to really focus on the value add that accessibility can bring along with thoughtful workflow solutions, and that is why we're bringing this webinar together because we see a way to bring technology and integrate it so that it can drive value for the market. And speaking of that, let's go over our agenda real quick. We did our introduction, so that's good. We nailed that. We're going to talk to you about why we focus on PDF though in the accessibility market. And we're going to talk about digital production. We're going to give you some terms that might help you as you're talking to other departments in your organization. We're going to talk about accessible PDF, which is really important, and that it's a way to make things inclusive in your environment and your communications to your end customers. And we're going to give you solutions, but we can educate you a lot, but the goal here is to really give you a solution or set of solutions and a set of strategies that you can start to employ. And then we'll let you know how to reach out to us if you have questions, because we would love to chat with you and give you more ideas about how you can take this forward in your organization. So without further ado, Dave, I'm going to turn it over to you and let's talk about digital accessibility and why it's important.
Absolutely. So, what is digital accessibility? I mean, that's really the first question here. And, there's a transition, obviously, in this market from print communications to digital delivery. We're all seeing it. Everyone gets opt-outs from your bank and your financial organizations and your insurance companies and stuff. Would you like to receive your statement electronically? Would you like to see your bank statement or your invoices electronically? So as that transition has occurred, it's got some benefits to it. Obviously, you're going to have some savings on printing. You're going to have savings on mailing costs and things like that. But there's some hidden costs that people are not aware of that are very important if you're going to move to a digital delivery of this type of content. And that's digital accessibility. So what does that mean? And what that means is when you send out an email, you send out an attachment, you set up in your portal that your clients can digitally retrieve a PDF of their statement. It needs to be able to be read and used and processed by everyone. And so just sending somebody a PDF file, if let's say they're blind and they're using a screen reader, if they get a PDF document that they can't open up and they can't read their statement, that's a problem, obviously, and that's not being inclusive of everyone. And in fact, legally, you can get yourself in trouble for excluding them by not adding accessibility to the documents. So there's legal reasons we have to be accessible. There's customer experience reasons we want to be accessible. We want everyone to be able to experience the same thing on the same way, in the same level. So these volume documents, documents that are generated and sent out need to be created in an accessible format. And we'll talk about what that means here in a minute. So, our focus is typically on PDF. So why is the focus on PDF? Well, PDF has really become digital paper in the market. I mean, when Adobe came out with that standard way back in, I think, the 1990s, when it was first released, PDF has continued to evolve, and it has a lot of benefits from a security standpoint, and it can be read on almost any device. Everybody has PDF generation written or developed into their tools. So it's very easy to take, anything that was originally going to be printed and then have it saved as a PDF, as a digital representation of what would have been printed. They can be secured, they can be signed, and it's the third most used format on the web now. So, I mean, it's kind of interesting. Many years ago, they had talked about that PDF was really going away, and it was going to be replaced with EPUB, and it was going to be replaced with other formats. And that has tended to not be the case. And in fact, we pulled some information from the PDF Association, who's been tracking all of this, and they go all the way back to 2011, which, ironically, is when I first got into the accessibility field, was around 2011. And when I first came in, people were telling us, well, yeah, we know we have an issue with the accessibility of our PDFs, but it's going away. People are moving to EPUB, and that's going to be much more accessible formats are going to be out there. Well, when we look at this chart and you see PDF use on the web from 2011 until 2021, PDF has stayed steady or increased over the time, and really the other formats have fallen away. So Word and EPUB and the other ones are slowly disappearing, and PDF has remained the most popular format for a document on the internet right now.
And Dave, I mean, I think this is a really good place to insert this. One of the reasons we partner with CommonLook and CommonLook partners with Solimar. Solimar's been a huge supporter of the PDF standards pretty much since its inception in the early 90s, as you mentioned. We made a strategic direction in our workflow software to use it as a pivot point so that we are leveraging an ISO standard, that is managed when we do our emulations of older technologies like PostScript and PCL and Metacode. And that may not mean anything to the audience, but there's someone in your shop who's going to, kind of nod their head if they're getting that kind of data in. And the important thing is that when you get things to PDF, you create a synergy. And it's important not only for your accessibility goals, it's important for your production goals, because what we've seen more and more, we do a global business, as does many people, and what we see around the world in printing is that people are aligning to the PDF standard, not only for their digital asset management and their storage and their presentment and their accessibility, but they're leveraging it as the key standard in their organization to drive printing production, to drive reprints, to drive long-term storage, because there are so many technologies that can optimize it, make it flexible, make it viewable. And I imagine anyone watching this who has children could ask their kids today if they know what a PDF is, and they've probably already interacted with them in school or through some sort of e-textbook over the last few years, especially. So it really is an interesting thing that has happened with that portable document format, which is what PDF stands for.
Exactly. And it went away from being, an Adobe proprietary format to basically an open source format at this point, which helps as well. So let's talk a little bit about PDFs and accessibility. Many times, we have heard in the past that, well, PDFs just can't be made accessible. And there's some truth to that from the standpoint of, if I just generate a PDF from a traditional application, so I do print a PDF, or if I go to a copier, and I make a photocopy of a document, and then I save it on the copier as a PDF, or it emails me as a PDF. Well, that PDF is probably very inaccessible. Doesn't mean it can't be made accessible though. So that's a myth as far as accessibility is concerned. So how does a PDF made accessible? Well, we're going to talk about that here in a couple minutes. There's also some myths out there that, well, I don't have to make my PDFs accessible. If there's another way somebody can get the information, I can have a phone number on my website, or I can say, we can give you an alternative format if you ask. We can give you Word, or we can give you something else. Even that might not be accessible. So the way the government has looked at this, and the way the Department of Justice has looked at this, is that if you're providing content on the web, it needs to be accessible. If you're providing content to your clients in your digital workplace as a portal that they log into to get their statements, that content needs to be accessible to your clients. So when we talk about accessibility, and then we talk about, well, it's not a myth, they can be made accessible. Why is it such a problem then, and why aren't people doing it? You would think everybody would just adopt this and start doing this. Well, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into what's involved in accessibility here in a minute. But, you can go into Adobe Acrobat and you can add the tags. And so what are the tags? So when you look at a PDF document, you're looking at the physical view. You're seeing what the document looks like. If you've printed the document, and what you're seeing on the screen and what you're going to see that comes out of your printer is going to be the physical view of the document. And that's the layout, the structure, the way it's designed. That stays static. What the tag tree does is that's what's read and consumed by a screen reader or other assistive technologies. So that tag language needs to accurately describe all the attributes of the document, because that's what somebody's listening to when they open a document. So if I was blind and I opened up a PDF document, it's going to announce a table of contents. It's going to announce that there's heading levels, hopefully. It's going to announce that there's a list or a chart or a figure, and then what the alternative text is for the description of that chart or graph or figure. So this is what you're listening to, is the tag tree. And if the document creation tools are not generating a proper tag tree, the experience of the person that's going to try to consume that document using a screen reader or another assistive technology, it's going to be a poor experience, and then it's going to be deemed an inaccessible document. So adding the tags is part of the process. Doing it correctly is very much part of the process. It can be a difficult process if you don't have the right tools to do it. And you need to have the knowledge of how it needs to be done.
And Dave, I think this is a great plug for another webinar we did together with our teams, where we talked about inclusivity, and you can find a link to that in the description of this video, but it's also on our various landing pages as partners. But we show an example of it in that webinar that we did as well. So I would invite people to go look for that CommonLook and Solimar inclusivity, where we talk about why communications need to be inclusive, and we actually show a demo of what happens when you get a poor screen read document, and then we show you the after of how it should be. We're not going to do that today, but it's out there for you to consume, and it could give you another idea as to why this is so painful for people who are trying to interact with your documents. That's one of the big problems.
Absolutely. So let's jump into what is an accessible PDF and what's necessary to make a PDF accessible. So what we have here, I have a slide up on the anatomy of an accessible PDF. And yeah, it's a very busy slide. It's showing a lot of content, but to describe what we're talking about here, and then we're going to look at some actual PDFs here in a second. It starts at the authoring stage. What fonts did you use? What font sizes did you use? There's another spin-off of accessibility, which is usability. And when we talk about making a document accessible, and we talk about working with a screen reader, well, blindness is not the only disability. There's color blindness, there's low vision. I have my readers around my neck here because I can't read things that are in small print or hard for me to read. So when you're trying to make a document accessible, you do want to author it with usability and accessibility in mind. So if you use the smallest possible fonts, you're not helping anybody in many regards. You're going to worry about your color and your color contrast. If somebody's colorblind and you have light gray and dark gray, or blue and reds and greens that are against a background that's similar to that shade of that color, it can be very difficult to read. In some cases, it could just be completely invisible to somebody who's colorblind. So color and color contrast levels are something at the authoring stage you want to put into the design of the document to allow it to be accessible. And then you get down into the nitty gritty of the content of the document. So when we talk about styles, we're talking about, proper use of heading levels and lists and images and bookmarks and tables of contents. We're going to talk about reading order here in a second. All of this content at the authoring stage and at the design stage of the document needs to be thought through, so that when you actually then tag the document for accessibility, it can be tagged for accessibility because the document has been formatted correctly. So it makes a big difference. So when we talk about, PDF accessibility, we kind of have 8 steps to what's necessary, what in the content needs to be worked on and looked at to ensure a document's accessible. The very first definition of accessibility, and it's the one that the W3C, which is the standards board international organization out there that basically regulates accessibility and helps develop some of the standards. So you'll hear WCAG or WCAG 2.1 or 2.0 AA. These are standards for accessibility that we can measure it. So I can measure that you've met this standard or I've met this standard with the content that I've developed. So we talk about 8 steps. The first thing is the document has to be tagged. PDFs by default are not tagged. So there is no provisions for accessibility whatsoever in a PDF that's typically generated, unless you're using a tool that's tags aware and will generate the tags. So you have to have PDF tags. And those tags, as I'll show you in the next slide, are really describing all of the content. The second thing that you need to have is metadata. The metadata is, like when we look at a document or we look at a directory and we find the file that we're looking for, this is the title of the document. This is who created the document. This is what language the document's in. All of that information is important, especially if you're using a screen reader, which would announce these things. So I can decide, is this the document that I'm looking for? Do I want to open it up and read it and listen to it? So having metadata in the document is an accessibility requirement. As I mentioned earlier, the use of color and how color contrast is put into the document is a critical component and a requirement of accessibility, because without it, we're going to have, other people that are going to be excluded due to the use of color. Images that are in a document will need to have alternative text or alt text. So if I've put an image in a document, let's say it's a chart of my bank, statement, balance over the last, 2 months. If you click on that image and there's no alternative text, it's basically going to say figure, and then we don't know what the figure is about in a screen reader. So we're not going to know what's in that chart or that graph. So alternative text is a written description of what's the important information in that image, chart, graph that somebody needs to understand. That why was it put there? Why did I author and put that chart in there? Well, I want to tell somebody what their bank balance was over the last 3 months. So that alternative text is very important. Lists in documents are typically messy when they come out of other tools. And when a screen reader does, when it encounters a list, is it announces a list, and then it says the list has, say, 5 items, 5 bullets. And then the person can listen to each bullet within the document. Without that being properly defined, that list can be very confusing, and you won't tie the bullets together that they're all under a certain heading or something like that. So it can be very confusing. Tables are a huge issue with accessibility. And when tables are not formatted properly, trying to find my bank balance that's underneath, average balance in these dates and these times doesn't make any sense when I'm listening to a table and I can't hear the row headers and the row column headers and then the data that I'm listening to in a certain cell. It's just going to be complete gibberish and it's not going to make any sense. So tables, when they're tagged correctly, will work fine with a screen reader, and the person can navigate and find what they're listening to and looking for. But when they're not done correctly, it's a big problem. There are then additional components that need to be tagged. Let's say there's a decorative image in the background of the bank's, floral image of something. That if it doesn't have any purpose, there's no communication, it's not giving us any important information. It's just a decorative image. It needs to be archived. It needs to be tagged as not tagged so that it won't be read by a screen reader that, hey, there's a decorative image on the background and a watermark on the back of this document. There's no reason to do that. It just makes it confusing. And then finally, we add this step that you really need to then test your documents for accessibility. So once you've generated all of these components, you need to be able to go in and test the documents and make sure they're accessible. There's tools to do testing that will give you accessibility reports based on the documents. The documents can be tested with a screen reader. They can be tested by people with disabilities. There's a number of different ways to test documents. And it's important as part of your accessibility program to do some testing so that you can ensure that the efforts you're making are worthwhile. So the next slide I wanted to show you is really just, what the tag tree looks like in a document versus looking at the physical view of a document. So, I have this brochure up on the screen, and as you can see, there's a tag tree on the left-hand side, and then you can see the physical view on the right. And you can see that I have highlighted the heading of this document, and then that's heading level 1 in the tag tree. So if we were to tab through this, first of all, just a little bit of education on using a screen reader. Somebody who's blind that's using a screen reader does not use a mouse because they can't visually, move the mouse around to where they need to go on the screen. So when you're blind, you use a computer completely by keyboard, and the tab key becomes an important component of that, because if you need to be able to tab through the website or tab through a Word document or tab through a PDF to go to the various pieces of content, and then the screen reader is going to read what you're highlighting as you scroll through it. So in the case of a tagged PDF, for example, this brochure, the order of these tags needs to be the proper reading order of this document. So, left to right, top to bottom. When you hit features, for example, in the table here, the reading order should be features announced as the top of a table, and then each of these bullets would then be read off as I would tab down through this list of the features of this product. That image on the right-hand side, you could decide that's decorative, or you could decide that is actually conveying some information, but it's showing people using the CommonLook tool to make their documents accessible. Let's say I got this document and I wanted to go to the third page because that's where my statement, the table of contents says that's where my statement balance is. I should be able to read the table of contents, go to the third page, and go straight to my statement balance by being able to navigate this tag tree and not have to just listen to the entire thing top to bottom. What a screen reader is not, it's not something that just reads all of the text in one big stream, out to a user. That's not really usable to somebody. They don't want to listen to every single component of this document and see the different, places where we have an office, unless that's what you're looking for. So that's how the documents work on the tag tree level on the left, and then how the physical view on the right. So for every document you create, there needs to be a corresponding tag tree that's going to be built into the document. It's not something that's seen, it's another view of the document, and that's where the accessibility is added in.
Dave, I want to add in, so for those people who are watching this, we're going to jump in here in a second to high volume production of documents. And I think people watching this are going to be familiar with creating regulated communications or volumes of communications for their brand and their organization that need to go out. Think about this, if you're in the composition end, or the people, you're going to be interfacing with the people who are creating the documents. A lot of volume documents are created by people using keyboards. And it's actually something that, because I've worked on the composition or the pre-production side where we're creating the templates that people fill in interactively for different industries, banking, healthcare, insurance. They have the same use case when you're developing how to fill in a template that you're trying to create these volume, documents from, because they tab. They don't use a mouse, it's too slow. So try to relate why this is so important in your organization to other things people also find important. And I think you're going to find that you have that credibility to bring for why these solutions really need to be taken seriously in 2022, right, Dave? That these are critically important when you're trying to produce communications that all of your customers can interact with high degree of satisfaction and engagement.
So that's a perfect segue into where we're going, Jonathan, and I'll turn it back over to you to talk about solutions for volume produced documents.
Which is awesome, because that is Solimar's long-term, we're 31 years plus now and counting, and we have traditionally focused on workflows or automated software-driven processes, templated processes that will drive high volumes of information through production processes, whether that be print or a mixture of print and digital delivery, including making sure that things are going out to accessibility. So we're going to talk about what are volume documents. In this case, we are choosing to focus on PDF because we believe that PDFs, as Dave shared from our wonderful PDF association that we're also members of, that they're the most plentiful out there in terms of structured content that we engage with, right? So we're not talking about HTML5 and those kind of things, because that's not really structured printable content, but still needs to be made accessible. And CommonLook has that AC360, the accessible 360 company that can help you with all of that. So if you're interested in web accessibility, make sure you reach out to Dave. But PDFs, they're generally, when we talk about creating them in volume, so we're going to be talking about bank statements, let's say mortgage statements, anything with a statement in the title. We're explanation of benefits, or you might hear them termed EOBs, offer letters, direct mail is created in high volumes when we're sending offers out to people, whether that be retail or financial or real estate, all kinds of things. Education is a huge producer of high volume because every student needs communications at every university, every high school, every school system in the world, governments, state governments, federal governments. You are getting high volume communications, whether you've really sat back and thought about it or not. And generally, these are created, as I mentioned before, right, Dave, by templates. We don't have people opening a Word-like document and starting from scratch and designing the document every time the statement goes out. They're templates, they're regulated, they're generally highly reviewed and QC'd so that you get something that is only yours. There's security related to it. And the important part of this, and what you can see on the screen, is that mid to large size organizations will use PDFs to do this, and they can exceed volumes of 100 million pages per year. And the people who are managing this have a lot of responsibilities to make sure that these things are done correctly, with quality. And now we really are trying to get people to make sure that they're accessible, because if they're not accessible, you have a whole portion of your population who cannot engage with your communications, which means they may switch from your company and your brand faster. They may call into customer service, driving your customer service costs up. And our goal in this webinar, in this conversation with you, is to let you know that there are tools on the market today that can help you put these solutions in place in a much less painful way than probably ever before in the past. And we want a chance to talk that through with you, especially given the labor impacts we've seen over the last few years. We know people are strained in labor, so leveraging your templated, automated processes is going to be really important when you look at these high volume document markets. So an example that I'll pull up here for you is a statement. So this is very specifically a Solibank statement. It is fake, but we designed it so that we could talk through what a credit card like statement would be. You can move this to an investment statement, a mortgage statement, a health bill, all sorts of things. They work very similarly, right? They're going to have very key information like who it's going to, the address, on this particular example, you're going to see USPS IMB barcode, which becomes a problem if you go and look at that example that we shared. You can go look at that other webinar about inclusivity. When a screen reader reads the IMB, really unfortunate to have to listen to, but these kind of statements are coming every day to people. We probably get one every day, if not at least multiple times a month, because we probably have car payments and insurance payments and bank statements and all sorts of things coming to us. And so these are critical to people, and it's their impression of your brand. So that is why being able to interact with it is so important. And if I just switch over to an accessibility automation workflow, we'll bring up this visual of how you can bring this to your environment. I'm going to ask Dave to talk through some of the CommonLook interaction points here.
Jonathan, before you jump into that, so on a statement like this sample that we're talking about here, there's really two ways it can be made accessible. You can do it, prior to generating the PDF, or you can do it to the PDF after the PDF's been generated.
That's a great point.
And typical tools that, let you build the template will allow you to assign accessibility, structure to the document when you do the design. So, why don't people do that, and why aren't they just solving it at the point of creation, which is certainly an option. There's many reasons why that's not taking place, or if it's taking place, it's not being done very well.
Right.
Some of it is you have to be an expert in accessibility. You do have to understand the structure and what's required, to be able to generate it. You also need to have ways to test it. But probably one of the biggest things is, many organizations have thousands of templates. They've been generating these over time, and their systems have been built up. They'd have to go back and do, accessibility audits of all of their templates, redesign all of their templates, and it's just not feasible to do so. So fortunately, there's technologies out today that can actually do the work after the PDFs are generated.
No, those are great points, Dave, because what happens is we think about going upstream to where it's being designed, and in a lot of cases, like you say, that is really difficult to achieve. So you can look at doing it in both places, right? You can do net new stuff with new kinds of focus on accessibility, but then, as you say, an organization may have thousands of templates that are even regulated, that in order to change them, they would have to get more approval. But because those are being delivered appropriately through print and mail, you can then deliver the alternative format in an electronic version. You may not be able to save the print. In a lot of cases you can, but in some organizations we know you can't, because that's the record, the official delivery of their statement. But then you can do these thoughtful deliveries of electronic accessibility PDF, accessible PDF, and you can do so in a less painful way today with automation. So if we bring up the workflow here, think about standardizing on PDF. So whether your environment prints PDF or not today, we can help you get there. Just know that we won't cover how we do that a lot today, but we can do it. And that's a part of a Solimar 31-year history and counting, which we're very proud of. But if you look at this, once you're in that PDF format, when you're going to print, you need to know what your intention is. And so that's one of the other reasons, right, Dave, that it's hard to go up to composition and say, oh, we'll put all of this into the templates you're creating up in pre-production in the composition area where you're creating all the documents and templates. Well, those designers don't necessarily know if that file is going to go to the printer or to the electronic or both. And when you're a production manager, you don't want a lot of that content that's in the accessibility side coming through your print device, because it slows it down, it makes things a little less manageable, it can cause problems. So what you need is an interface, an intermediate system. We call it middleware, we call it post-composition in our world at Solimar, but what it does is it sits between the system that's creating the PDFs or the output, the composition, the pre-production. Once you get to your production system, then you need to look at this kind of accessibility automation that we have on the screen. So you have your PDF file. It may come into a chemistry solution, which is our platform, We're going to pick it up with automation. So if you don't need to know the names of all these things in that chemistry box, but know what happens is that we take a templated, rules-driven approach to making sure that documents with specific intentions go through your workflow the way you want. And so in this case, what we're showing is that a PDF file could go to our automation engine. It could have rules flagged based on the customer preference that it needs to be made accessible. At Solimar, we have the ability to do basic tagging, right, Dave? We can use our accessibility engine to make sure that tag tree that Dave showed earlier is there. And we can re-engineer that document as needed to make sure that certain things like logos and metadata and stuff are inserted where it needs to be. But that doesn't mean that it's being validated. So Dave, talk us through the lower half of where our system would then, through APIs and technology, pass that information over to the CommonLook system and be able to really make sure that we're doing the right things.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there's a number of different components of the accessibility journey, so to speak, of the document that, you know, we've addressed through the various API tools that we've developed. So one is just to do testing. You're getting documents and they're coming in from different sources, and you want to be able to test them for accessibility. If they pass, they can then be digitally delivered to the next stage of the workflow. If they fail, then you maybe are going to want to run them through an accessibility tool to add the accessibility work before you move on with the document. So we have a tool called Clarity that would be interfaced into the workflow here and could be called upon to test files and flag them for pass, fail, and then based on that, that could become part of the workflow. The second side of it is you may have in your electronic delivery journey the ability for your clients to opt for alternative formats. You see this very often in banking and in other industries where I can opt for a Braille version of my statement, or I can opt for a large print or an audio version. So in that case, you're not going to electronically deliver, you can't electronically deliver the PDF as Braille because it has to be printed on a Braille printer. So we have the ability to offload those statements and those documents through a very secure connection we're PCI compliant. So we can build an interface to retrieve those documents and then have them printed in Braille and then sent to the client, or delivered back to the organization to send to their clients. So we can do this through various different methods to provide alternative formats. But then finally, let's just say it's going to stay as PDF and it's going to be delivered to a portal for the clients to retrieve their statement from this month, last month, month before, all as an accessible PDF. We have an AI-based tool that can be called upon via API. So let's say the file comes in, it's tested for accessibility, it fails, it now needs to go to the AI engine. The AI engine would be built to be able to process the various formats of the statements, and then add all the accessibility tagging, do the verification, and then send the file on its journey to continue through the workflow. So with something like this, you don't have to start with accessible documents. You can keep all your existing workflow design templates as they sit today, and they can leverage this technology to do the work on the fly or do the work in batches. And then they can be delivered to that storage archive or e-delivery, portal, or in many cases, if they're going to be printed, they don't need the accessibility added. So you can also divvy it off in that direction. So the beauty of all this is it can be tightly integrated into your existing systems. You don't have to change your systems. The only thing that's going to deviate here is when do you, flag files to send to these systems to be able to do some additional processing and then continue on.
And I think that's the key, is that you can start in different ways that make sense for your organization. You don't have to do a rip and replace. Both CommonLook and Solimar systems believe in modularity, right, Dave? We believe in the most important thing is to get started, to start to create a path for your customers to be able to interact with your statements. and we can give you multiple ways. I love when you said AI, I just want to make sure everybody understands we are talking about artificial intelligence there. And that's so important. One of the things that I've learned from Dave over presenting with him over the last couple years now is that is so important because it learns as it goes. So you're starting at a certain spot, and then as your documents continue to be learned by the system, you can continue to let it get smarter and smarter to be able to handle those exception files. And that's a technology that's still relatively new on the market. And as far as I'm aware, CommonLook really has the cornerstone of the artificial intelligence side of this accessibility with PDFs. And it's one of the reasons we like to hand off to them as a partner, because they are so focused on the quality of their accessibility. As I said, we can put that tag tree in, but what Dave said is, you got to have expertise, right? You've got to have people that can still do that manual checking for you, do some QC, make sure that the automated workflows are producing what you want. And that clarity validator and the AI engine, that's a key component of making sure that you have a functional long-term workflow, right, Dave?
Now, there's no question. And, the term AI is tossed around there by pretty much everybody nowadays. Everything's AI driven. The robot, vacuuming your floor is AI driven. I mean, that's kind of how this has gotten. But, to differentiate artificial intelligence from machine learning, there's some tools out there to tag PDFs that are basically written around doing machine learning, basically algorithms. Basically, this is the rule for this, do this. When you encounter this, do this. And that, will get you to a certain point, but it won't get you completely there. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But it's very hard to come up with a fixed set of rules for PDF documents, because PDF documents are incredibly complex. There's a lot of information stored in them. And when you're using just machine learning and algorithms written to do, fixed functions, you very quickly run out of, solutions for problems, and you create more problems along the way. Our AI tool is in its second generation. In the first generation, it was very much machine learning. It was very much those algorithms and those rules. We realized that was not going to be correct for the market. And that's when we went to our deep neural learning AI tool, where we actually would take these statements and we remediate them for accessibility to our standards driven level. And then that's what we teach the tool. The tool would take your statements and samples of your statements, and then it's taught the deviations. It's taught what to do when you encounter this, and then how to correctly tag that. So once the tool is taught and then it continues to learn, it's pretty amazing what the results can be.
Well, Dave, I think that's a perfect segue to giving them some steps to achieve this. I'm going to let you take the lead here and lead us through the ways that you look at this, from standards compliance all the way through how to get started. And I'll just give you some color commentary as needed.
Very good. So the first step is really around testing your files for standards compliance. Right now you're generating output and you're sending these volume documents, likely to your client. You're moving, if you haven't already moved, you're moving towards electronic delivery. So you should take and pull some of your sample statements and test them for accessibility. So how do you do that? Well, the best way to do it would be to take a screen reader and actually listen to the document like we did in that previous recording, as we showed examples of. But short of that, there's free tools that you can download to do your testing. There's a tool called Pack3 that's freely available to download. CommonLook has our own tool called Validator, and it will actually test the documents to multiple standards. So let's say your Health and Human Services requirements, you have to meet HHS requirements for accessibility. We can test against HHS, or if it's WCAG 2.1, AA, we can test against WCAG 2.1 or PDF UA, which is a very common ISO standard for accessibility. So, if you don't know where you sit today, it's a good idea to download a couple of your statements, run them against one of these tools. They'll generate accessibility reports that will list out, what's good and what's bad and what needs to be fixed to ensure your documents are accessible. So that's the first step, is doing testing. So, as I talked earlier about accessibility tools, the PAC3 and the CommonLook tool, automated tools will only get you so far. I mean, they're going to test for, is there heading levels? Is there a reading order that appears to be correct? Is there images that have alt text descriptions and things like that? You can also download NVDA, which is a free screen reader. And that tool is something that you can install on a computer and then actually listen to the document and see what that user experience is. So that's another good testing tool to consider. And it also doesn't have any cost, which is great. So the second component of this is, you need to look at where are you going to fix the accessibility issues? Where are you going to look at what's the best solution? So we have, that pre-production, which is at the template level. So when we looked at that Solimar Solibank statement sample that we generated, that was generated from a template. So, do we want to fix the accessibility at the template level? Does the tool support tagging, which most of them do? I think they all do at this point. But then, do we have the knowledge to go in? Okay, let's say we ran those accessibility reports and we looked at those reports and we can see that we're not using proper heading levels and we're not defining lists properly and we're doing a bunch of other things not correct. Do we want to go in pre-production and change the template and then do the testing again to test the results and then see what we're seeing or listening to in the case of a screen reader and make those changes? Or do we just have too many templates and it's going to be too much work or effort to fix it at that level, and we want to look at a post-production solution, which is more along the lines of that AI tool we talked about, where you've already done your workflow, you've already generated the PDFs, they're now coming downstream to go to printing or go to archiving or go to e-delivery through a portal. And if that's going to be your workflow, there's the opportunity to insert accessibility before they're actually delivered to the clients.
And I think that the one thing I just want to interject real quick here is, you might hear it called pre-production or composition, depending on what department you're talking to. Post-production might also be called post-composition, depending on who you're talking to. So make sure you're listening for these terms so that you can relate to the people who are in the terms that they know, and that you can be the arbiter of bringing accessibility across these various departments, because you will cross multiple departments as you're trying to figure out how to insert accessibility. And to Dave's point, when you look at doing it pre-production or in that composition area where the templates are being generated by a system, think about what happens when it gets down to your production floor, your environment where the production manager's making the decisions or tools are making the decisions. You might have to think about using a tool like Solimar to then remove some of that accessibility if you do it at the template level, because you don't want it to go through your printer. So there's a lot of things that we can help you with as you look at this. And I think Dave is a pretty consultative guy and he's got a lot of great people on his team. You can talk to CommonLook and they'll be able to pull people like me in to help you understand the decision points. And that might change, Dave, where you want to do it. You might want to do, as I said, you might want to do specific things because you have data-driven splits only going to electronic delivery out of your composition system. Maybe that's a great place to start bringing the tagging upstream. But
Sure.
For stuff that you're not sure of or where you have to deliver both, you might want to do it down in the post-production, post-composition area because it is more flexible, it's more achievable, and it's more cost effective. So we really do want to be consultative with you so that you get the best environment for your delivery needs for your customers.
There's definitely not a one size fits all here. And from an accessibility standpoint, sure, it's great if you can add the accessibility at the time of creation of the document, through the template. That all sounds fine, but again, that might not fit your work environment. For the reasons that Jonathan has laid out here. It makes perfect sense. On the post-production side or post-composition side, there's really only two solutions you can do. There's some auto tagging tools on the market that will add tags to the document. Many cases, they don't get you 100% compliance. and you may need to do some manual touch up and remediation of the output that comes out of those tools. And because of the high volumes that we're talking about, I mean, we talk to banks all the time, and they 100 million files, 100 million pages is almost, it's the standard number. I mean, that's how much volume of these documents is generated on an annual basis. So many times it just does not become practical to be able to do so. There's too many templates and the volumes are so high, you can't do any manual touch up, you can't do any manual remediation. This all has to be automated. And so if you're going to do this through automation, you're going to want to use a tool that can allow you to add the accessibility, do the testing, and generate the documents at the volume levels that you're looking for to move this in the right direction. So the third thing to talk about here or to consider is your volume. I mean, if your volume is very low, there's not going to be a lot of reasons to add an automation solution. You can, pull those documents out. They could be manually remediated, which is another process to add accessibility tagging. They're basically very similar to like what you would do with Braille. You would pull the documents that somebody has requested as accessible, and they would be tagged by, accessibility remediation people, and then tested and then delivered back into the stream and then delivered to the clients. But if you've got automation solutions that are generating, high volumes, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of documents, maybe millions of pages of documents, automation is going to be almost your only solution. And it's critical that you find a solution that can do this and keep up with your volume considerations. So then the fourth thing is putting this into production. So many organizations we talk to have this on their radar. To give you kind of a, without mentioning client names, we're very active in the healthcare business market. Many clients that are do healthcare insurance, and the government has dictated to them during open enrollment, these are the documents, these are the forms, this is the layout of everything. They have to use their cookie cutter documents that come from Medicare or Medicaid or whichever organization is that drives that. So they've made those documents accessible. They have processes for making sure those documents are accessible to everyone. But when we talk to those organizations, when we start talking about, well, your directories or some of the other documents that maybe are changed all the time as new doctors are added to the services and things like that, and we talk to them about automation, they're like, well, that's on our radar. It's something we know we need to do, but we just haven't gotten to it yet. But we do know we need to do it. And, I mean, there's no such thing as partial accessibility. It doesn't work. I mean, if I'm blind and I can, sign up for my insurance and I can get my, policy, as accessible, and I can get my exclamation of benefits as accessible, but now I can't get my statement, or my bill as accessible. Now there's the barrier. Now I can't do business with you, or I can't interact with you because I can't understand it, because I can't read it, can't hear it. So you need to look at these other systems, and the time is now to really start finding out and determining how we can automate and add accessibility into these production systems. It can be added into the workflow. It can be not disruptive. It can be integrated in through API calls. And partners that we're working with like Solimar are ideal for this, because as Jonathan said earlier, having that middleware, being able to take what's been produced by your system that's a PDF and now being able to do some manipulation to it, including adding accessibility before it's then delivered to continue on through your workflow, is critical. And we just add the accessibility piece. So, we need to work with companies like Solimar that can help the clients solve their business problems using the tools that they have. And then the last thing to consider, because we're seeing organizations that are moving to accessibility, you need to find a way, if you're going to be truly inclusive to everyone, you need to think beyond just accessible PDF and have a way for clients, just like you have clients that can opt in for, I don't want my statement mailed to me anymore, I want to opt in for electronic delivery. You need to have a way for your clients to opt in for alternative formats. Accessible PDF is great. It works with a screen reader, works with other assistive technologies. But, if somebody uses Braille and they don't have an electronic device, they need to they're going to get a printed piece of paper, but they need theirs in Braille, not printed, because they don't use a computer, for example. You need to have a way to be able to send your statement to them for the handful of people that are going to request it. It's all part of customer service. Same thing with large print. I got my readers, as I laughed about earlier, but if you don't have readers and you need large print to be able to read it, you need to have a way for people to be able to ask for these alternative formats for their documents as a customer service, as an accessibility feature, as an ADA requirement. These are all important ways to improve the customer experience and to offer the best customer experience to your clients.
Totally agree, Dave. I think that getting started, put it, the number 4 and 5 are so important. Don't let time or the day-to-day get in the way of offering it, because it is so important to the customer experience. And we know that there's a huge focus on that people will switch brands based on their experience, but also you incur a lot of costs if you don't have ways that people can easily interact with your communication. So you're going to see people calling in, or the family members of people calling in, which is a whole nother problem based on some privacy laws. So you really do want to try to solve these problems, and we are here to help. Because we're doing this as an on-demand webinar, we can't really take your questions, but we will if you email us. We'd love for you to get in touch with Dave or I. We're happy to answer any questions. We really play the role in our organizations of market educators, of solution facilitators. And as you get more interested, we can get you to team members that can give you more details, right, Dave? But we're here to provide education, to provide information, to help prove to the market that this is achievable today, that it's easier than ever. And one final thing I'd like to offer just as we wrap up, Dave, is that we also talk about in some of our other webinars that you have to plan for the cost of this. This is a true experience that someone's going to have, so it isn't free. And just like postage and envelopes and paper and ink, you want to, if you turn off the print to deliver the accessible PDF, you want to make sure that you're not just assuming you're saving that money, that you're making sure you're investing in the accessibility, because it's so important to the experience. So I always like to mention that. Dave, I'm sure you have a couple of thoughts on that, because it's important that this is for the benefit of the customer, but it's also something you have to invest in.
No, it really is. I mean, I know they say that the cost to, you lose a customer, the cost to find a replacement customer is a high cost in any business. So you don't want to have customer attrition. So you need to find ways to make sure you keep the customer experience the best that it can be, and in providing accessible content and making that client experience the best that it can be. This is all necessary to be able to do.
And some other ways that you can think about, once you find the way to put these solutions in place, people like Solimar can help you do things like put QR codes on your printed statements that let people know that they can easily opt into these accessible PDFs. You can create a true brand statement about it with your marketing teams once you have it all in place, once you're confident of the process. And that just goes even further to drive the importance of it, right? It shows that your brand is inclusive. And so we can help you with all of that. We can help you add things to messaging, to the print, to then drive people to the accessibility. And we're excited to offer this with our partners, CommonLook. So we hope you'll reach out to us. Dave, I want to thank you for your time. I know we've done this presentation live at different events like the CSUN event for accessibility, and we will continue to do so, but it is so great to make sure that this is available whenever someone has time to interact with it. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan, and we love working with Solimar, and we're excited for where this is going in the world of accessibility, because we're seeing more and more companies adopt this every day.
Well, with that, we will end our webinar for today, and we hope you reach out to us. And just remember, accessibility is inclusivity. So we will hopefully talk to you soon.
Thank you, everybody.